I want to welcome you to a second in a two-part series called Research in the Real World. My name is Tomás Jiménez. I'm a faculty member in sociology, and I'm also one of the founding co-directors, along with Brian Lowry, who's sitting right over there, of the Institute for Advancing Just Societies. And this is a joint venture between the Institute for Advancing Just Societies and the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity. The Institute is focused on amplifying and supporting solutions-focused research toward racial and ethnic justice. And the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity, almost 30 years old now, is really a kind of pioneer in the study of race and ethnicity, fashioning a model of education and research and the collaboration between the two that has served as a model for other similar organizations throughout the country. And we're really excited to be partnering with CCSRE. And I want to just acknowledge our core partner here, Paula Moya, who is the director, and Alfredo Artiles, who's the director of the Research Institute inside of the center. And while I'm at it, I want to also acknowledge a couple of our founding directors, Claude Steele and Al Camarillo, who are here as well. Thank you. So today's conversation is about community-engaged public safety, and we're going to be in conversation about research that is done in collaboration with community. There are lots of folks at Stanford who are doing this research across the campus, and today's conversation, I think, will pull out what is a demonstration of the best version of this kind of research, a real exemplar. And we're going to dive in all aspects of it, from the origin to the findings, some of the challenges and potential solutions. So I'm going to sit so we can start to engage in this conversation in earnest. And I want to start off by introducing our distinguished guest. To my immediate left in the middle here is Lena Miller. Lena Miller is the founder and CEO of Urban Alchemy, and Urban Alchemy is a nonprofit organization with a mission to transform people and places through love and respect and to heal communities challenged by the intersection of extreme poverty, mental illness, addiction, and homelessness. And in her capacity as CEO, Lena has been a leading innovator in applying trauma-informed principles to public challenges that I just named. She also, in leading Urban Alchemy, has created the largest community-based public safety program in the nation, which operates not only in San Francisco, we'll talk mostly about San Francisco today, but also in Los Angeles, Austin, Texas, and Portland, Oregon. Prior to founding Urban Alchemy, Dr. Miller was the executive director and founder of Hunters Point Family Agency, and Lena Miller has a doctorate in psychology from the University of San Francisco. Welcome, Lena. Thanks for being here.
I just want to also acknowledge my co-founder and the COO, Mr. Bayron Wilson. We built this together, so I wanted to make sure that I acknowledge.
Thank you. Welcome, Bayron. And to my left, your right, is our very own Forrest Stuart. Forrest Stuart is a professor in the Sociology program. He's also the director of the Ethnography lab and the undergraduate program on urban studies. He, in addition to being a prolific scholar, and I guess in recognition of Forrest as a prolific scholar, he's a 2021 winner of the MacArthur Genius Award, which, for those of you who don't know, that's a really big deal. And Forrest is slow to brag about that, so I brag about it for him. Forrest is the author of 2 award-winning books. The first is Down and Out and Under Arrest, which is based on a 5-year ethnography in Skid Row. His more recent book, Ballad of the Bullet, is an ethnography based on his time with a gang that not only produced drill music, but was kind of a proliferator of the music and also the consumption of not only the drill music that they produce, but also others. And he's working on a third book, which is based on the research that he's done in collaboration with Lena and Urban Alchemy. So please join me in welcoming Forrest Stuart. So thank you both for being here, and I want to get right into it and start with you, Lena, and then I'll throw it over to Forrest. And I want to ask you to kind of give a brief origin story, if you can, about your background and how it led you to the work that you do with Urban Alchemy.
I'm going to try to manage my time because I can take a long time going through this. So I'm a San Francisco native, third generation, grew up in San Francisco's Bayview Hunters Point community. A lot of people may know it's a historically black community, kind of isolated in San Francisco in the southeast. A lot of issues, particularly during the 80s. The crack epidemic really hit us hard. It went from one of the strongest working class communities in San Francisco, where the highest home ownership, and really, I would say a fun place to grow up. Bayron, my co-founder, is also, grew up in the community, but we watched a lot of tragedy and trauma with the 80s and 90s. I then, one of the first things I did after I got my master's in social work, I was about 23 years old, had just had my first baby, started a program called Girls 2000, which was the precursor of Hunters Point Family. And Brother Mark, who's right here with us now, is, somebody who was in the community. He didn't work with us at the time, but really somebody who kind of centered me and helped me kind of push through a lot of the challenges and so on and so forth. So I'm blessed to be with people who, and have built this with people who grew up in the community and really understand what that was like. And so, it evolved over time. It first started working with young people who, didn't quite, I'm looking at it now, we're Gen X, right? We're the generation that raised ourselves, all the latchkey kids. And particularly, when the crack epidemic hit, that got really, really intense. So that particular program, youth development program just for girls living in public housing in Bayview Hunters Point, well, that continued to grow and grow as other kids also wanted the services in the program. So it was really, based in community pride, community identity, resilience, that kind of thing. And then probably 25 years later, we started doing the Pit Stop program, really as just a way to get jobs. So that's the public toilets in San Francisco. And really for unhoused folks, right? Because Starbucks wasn't letting everybody in. And so I noticed it kind of pivoted. I was at the point in my life where I had done the same thing for 25 years and starting to feel just kind of like I was becoming stagnant. And so, we pivoted to, meaning Bayron and I pivoted to start Urban Alchemy, which was really focused on people coming home from prison after having done life sentences in particular. And that because we partnered with 111 Taylor, which was a halfway house. And so I was about in my third year at the doctoral program in psychology in USF. And my whole point was to study PTSD and trauma, because we had, not every but the program I had was specifically for youth who were active in the streets. Very similar to the group that Forrest was with in Chicago. So we dealt with a lot of homicides, a lot of people becoming, the perpetrators of homicide, and what, the impact on the whole community. So when I went to school, my intention was to be an expert in trauma, but I learned the flip side of it, which is if you come out of trauma in a healthy way, you get this superpower called emotional intelligence, right? Resilience, grit. And so that's kind of what I noticed with the guys who were coming out of 111 Taylor who had life sentences. And so they had this magic at those pit stops where it just transformed everything around them, because everyone would come back and tell me. And so we really developed this program. A lot of people think we're a homeless program. Really, that's not what we are. That's just what we do very well that nobody else can do. Really what we are is we provide careers and hopefully a legacy business. That's what we're working on for people coming home from prison after long sentences, whether it be life sentences or 10 years or more. So like I said, that could be really long. So I'll just pass it to Forrest because this, we could take the whole hour up with that. So.
Yeah, thanks, Lena. Forrest, what's your origin story working with Urban Alchemy? And I'll say, as a guy from LA, spent early part of your career at the University of Chicago, and then coming here just a few years ago. How did you get integrated with Urban Alchemy?
Yeah, thank you, and I just want to say thanks everyone for coming. I'm a big pusher of like public scholarship and public sociology, so this like feels as though this might be a little bit of a win, that we're talking about how academia can kind of blur the lines with folks in the streets doing amazing stuff. And I could listen to Lena this whole time, so I want you to keep going. I guess the super quick origin story since the early 2000s, I've been doing a lot of work, ethnographic work, on trying to understand the ways that our kind of turn to aggressive policing has kind of saturated and kind of insinuated itself into communities. And so when I first started doing my work, a lot of our attention was mostly on like the effects of mass incarceration, right? We know that, your chances of getting called back for a job interview are cut in half with the mark of a criminal record. We know you're 10 times more likely to be homeless. We knew all of these things. They were coming out in the late 90s and the early 2000s. And a lot of us in the early 2000s started to shine our light on the way kind of being exposed to aggressive policing on a daily basis also has these incredible consequences, right? People stop going to hospitals. People stop going to institutions that are important. People stop being good neighbors. People retreat into their homes. All kinds of things that a good civil society doesn't have. And so I've found city after city where I kind of wrote about these things. I think it was a pretty predictable story. And during 2020, I was at home like most of us with a 1-year-old and a 2-year-old and a newborn, and I was reading these stories coming out of the Chronicle that sounded really similar to what I had always kind of heard before I launched into a research project. So at the time, people were saying that the Tenderloin had descended into this hellscape, that it was a public health emergency. There was some article about how there was so much feces on the sidewalks of the Tenderloin that it was threatening the city's water supply. And Mayor Breed declared this emergency order, which rolled out some services. I think you all were involved in the emergency order. And one of the things that the emergency order said it was going to do was to roll out lots of police. And we've got a few of these, right? Call in the National Guard. We're going to call in CHP. We're going to call in additional police forces. And so I said, this is pretty typical for what I do. I'm going to go and I'm going to study what happens when there's tons of policing. And so, it was like after the first couple vaccines and my kids are okay. I remember I was walking down the hill. For those of you who know the Tenderloin, Lena, you know this story. I was walking down the hill on Hyde. Yeah, walking down the hill on Hyde. And I hit Eddy Street. And my way in, it's just, open air drug market. There's, people in, dealing with acute psychosis, kind of running into the streets. I mean, it looks worse than anything that I had ever seen. And, I spent 5 years in Skid Row. I spent, 5 years on the south side of Chicago. I mean, this was like nothing I had ever really seen before. And then I hit this street, and it was like this invisible barrier, or this like invisible line had been drawn down the street. And so on one side of the street, it looked the way the San Francisco Chronicle and Fox News kind of portrayed it. And on the other side of the street, there were kids like walking in a line to the Head Start program. There were people selling tamales out of coolers. There were people kind of peacefully coming in and out of the liquor store. And there were these, older, confident, black and brown men standing on the corners, kind of watching and making sure everything was all right, high-fiving with the kids that came in a line, escorting somebody with a cane and a wheelchair across the street. And I was kind of blown away. I'd never really seen anything like this before. And I didn't actually see any cops, which was the other thing that was super surprising. So not only were there no cops, the way that the San Francisco Chronicle put it out there, but there was this group of unarmed people kind of creating peace on the street in a way that I hadn't really seen it before. It took a few weeks. I crunched some numbers. I don't know if my grad student, Kylan, is here. I think he was going to drop by. We began crunching some numbers, and we discovered that in the 2 years after the pandemic really hit, crime in San Francisco had increased across all neighborhoods, except for the blocks where Urban Alchemy was stationed. In fact, we saw like this incredible, just doing a kind of descriptive crunch of the numbers, we see crime drop 20% compared to the rest of the city on these blocks. We see massive drops, maybe like 30% in terms of drug crime, whereas in Soma, just the neighborhood over, we saw a 220% increase in drug crimes during that same time. And so this convinced me I had to figure out what the hell this was, and asked some local activists who I had gotten to know to broker a meeting. And well, I guess we'll talk a little bit more about what happened after that. But that was my kind of intro to urban alchemy.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. So, Lena, you talk about one side of this this origin story, which is kind of about providing jobs to formerly incarcerated people, the kind of reentry aspect of it. And Forrest, your informal observation, walking into the Tenderloin, is really about public safety, right? About what sometimes sociologists call like social order or social disorder. They often call it, but social order. And so these are two sides of the same coin, I gather, given the work that you do. But I wonder if you can talk more about what you see as the main problem you're trying to address. And I feel like you've alluded to it a little bit, but what's the problem?
I think there's I'm gonna get in trouble for saying this. I think there's a lot that's set up in society that's intentionally set up for people to fail. We know what's going to make people fail. People think that we're such geniuses for putting together urban alchemy. Like, how did you think of that? Like, this stuff is common knowledge. It's like you give people a way to support themselves. They're not going to get involved in the underground economy. But the models that we use is let's just give people services so we can create a whole nother economy and job thing for usually, social workers, usually middle-class white social workers, right? Instead of just making sure people can support themselves. So I think that's a part of it. I also talked about, this is what first, what the city needed was they needed toilet staff, and it's a really hard job to do because people are independent. They're working in these areas that are like the most impacted, the hardest intersections in San Francisco, and you're leaving them alone. So not only do they kind of have to deal with the community and everything that comes and all the reasons why people were using those toilets before, which is why we were there, but also they're independent. Right? Which means if you don't have a good work ethic or something, you might decide you're going to run your own little personal business there. You might decide you're going to sleep in your car for a while and, while you're on your shift. There's all kinds of things because no one's watching you. But it just so happened because of the experience and the culture of people who had experienced long-term prison. I mean, God, some people were like shining them up and stuff, it was crazy. And then they had made friends with everybody, and the energy transformed around those spaces. And so I had all kinds of people from the city saying, can you clean the Tenderloin? Because that's a really hard job. They couldn't get anyone to do, not even people who work for the city. We're putting these new installations in Civic Center, which had been a mess, my entire life. I mean, the area between City Hall and UN Plaza. And I said, okay, well, we don't want to just be the muscle because that goes with the narrative that was starting to build, so we got to do engagement. And so we did that. And then it was like, everyone is using BART elevators for private bathrooms. And now you have people with, disabilities and strollers who can't use them, or, I won't go on about that. But people started asking us to do all this different stuff. And people were able to do it in a way that no one else had been able to do before. And so, so we started seeing, and then when COVID hit, it was like the city put tremendous pressure to keep increasing our work. So we went from like 65 employees to like 300 and 600 in a matter of months. And that was wild. So we ended up staffing the first 3 SIP hotels because no other providers would. But we saw every little single thing we had a bunch of people that were locked in the halfway houses. They couldn't get out, right? The people we're talking about, they can't work from home. And they weren't giving out checks with Trump signing his name back then. Nobody knew what was going to happen. So we saw like, man, jobs for our people, at least they can eat now. And it was like just trying to get as many as possible, like Harriet Tubman or Schindler's List. How many people can we get in, And so, but we had to be excellent at everything because we knew, because of who we were, everyone was going to be looking at us crazy, which came afterwards. After everyone's finished sheltering in place, they all came out to point the finger and criticize. But at the time, we knew how important it was for us to be excellent. And I think, people already had that culture of excellence anyway, which is part of survival and structure in prison. And so we were able to basically use that, what we call transferable skills. So instead of saying, oh, don't worry, you've been to prison, you don't have to be ashamed of that. You don't have to, it's like, no, let's elevate it. Let's take the things that work that kept people, thriving and surviving in the most difficult situations that got you here today, that got you out of prison from a life sentence, that got you to focus on being positive and giving back to your community. Let's elevate all those things and be proud of them and embrace the good part, right? Transferable skills. So that's kind of it.
I'm going to ask you to dive just a little deeper for a second on that. What does excellence look like then?
I think we all know what excellence is in every other field. We all forget about it in social services. And part of that is my criticism of social services, which we've become, a charitable model, which basically at the core of it is just be glad for what I give you. Beggars can't be choosy. But this is a multi-billion-dollar industry. Hilton knows what excellence looks like. Apple knows what excellence looks like. Turkish Airlines. I mean, we all know at Stanford. We all know what it looks like in different. It's only when we get to social services that all of a sudden we're like, oh, it's so hard. We don't know what is the right. No, we know exactly what the right. The research is out there. The work is out there. We know what excellence looks like. It's just about being dedicated and saying that, understanding that this is our business. We're happy to have it. And so we want to be the best at it. We want to establish our name. I'm sorry if nobody else has thought about it. So few people have thought about it before, but we're thinking about it. Every little thing we're trying to constantly improve and to constantly have evolution of our creativity and to improve our product, right, which is ourselves. And the community that we create, and constantly thinking about it. We're just thinking about it like everybody else thinks about it who have successful businesses, right? Who are trying to break out of just mom and pop shop to a national kind of model. So
the question we started off with just a second ago was what's the problem that you're trying to address? And so Forrest, what does that look like for you in your work?
Yeah, I love that. The problem for you is slightly different from how I would articulate the problem for me, but I think that it's the fact that you solving your problem begins to also at the same time solve the problem that I've been thinking about my entire career, which is how do we deal with the kind of simultaneous over-policing, over-criminalization, and under-protection of marginalized communities, right? And I think 2020 kind of brought this to the fore, that I think a lot of our conversations, at least for me, where I was sitting, were very much about reducing policing, but not about dealing with a kind of underprotection, right? Or dealing with a lack of safety, a lack of protection. And for me as a scholar, kind of lefty academic sociologist, this has been the kind of, I think, third rail of so many of the conversations that I've been in. Right? And I think in 2020, we hit a moment where we asked, I was being asked, okay, cool. So let's imagine a great world where we redistribute police resources right now. Tomorrow, that open air drug market's still going to be there. Tomorrow, this person's still going to be on the streets. What do we do right here, right now? And I don't think that certainly folks in my position had a very good answer. I mean, I can tell you about what a kind of equitable, mutual aid-filled kind of community looks like. I didn't have necessarily a theory of change. I think a lot of us are lacking kind of theory of change of the pragmatic steps we take today that begin to march us there. And so for me, this partnership I see as me trying to solve that, to try to leverage this partnership to try and give us some answers about what that might look like. Because I think what we see in practitioners, precisely because I think there's this organizational model of elevating the kinds of gifts and assets and skills that people have, elevating the kind of way that lived experience allows people to build trust with communities, elevating those kinds of things as part of a public safety model, actually builds the trust and the reciprocity so that we can do public safety based on connection rather than on coercion, right? Because I think that I think is at the crux of so much of my work and so much of the work of people that I love, some of the work of people here, is that, like, if it's not coercion, what is it? What's the thing that we use to perhaps get someone to, I'll use an example of a Tenderloin, like, not sell drugs in front of the Head Start Center, right? Or come out of Monday morning traffic, running with a shirt off, or go to walk down a block and go to the safe consumption site, right? The tools that we've used so far are all coercion based. And so this feels like this new kind of laboratory to think about, okay, if we were to think about connection and trust and reciprocity being at the root of our requests of people to change their behavior, how far can we go with that? And I think that this has been something that we've been doing further and further in this partnership is trying to kind of test the limits of, like, how far can connection actually get us.
Let's talk a little bit more about connection versus coercion and dive into the model that Urban Alchemy works under, which is community-based public safety. And so, Lena, you mentioned earlier that it's kind of common knowledge what we should do, but I might push back against that and say that I actually think common knowledge, or what some people call common sense, would say it's obvious what you do to increase public safety. You put more cops on the street. And in fact, there's research that would back that up, right? There's research that shows observationally and quasi-experimental design that you put more cops on the street, you get a reduction in violent crime. But you have a different model for achieving the same outcome, an outcome that Forrest has started to allude to. So I wonder if you can describe for us the model of community-based public safety and why it's different.
Well, you heard me describe kind of our origin story, which is at the toilets, the pit stops. So it wasn't necessarily saying we're going to transform public safety and we're going to do that. It was people saying, what's going on over there? I noticed everywhere you guys are, crime drops. This was at the very beginning. And we started trying to get the stats on it because we knew it. And all these people from the city kept pushing us to expand in their hardest places. They would never say that publicly, but they would say it to us. And so that would put us in kind of a bind because we didn't ever have anything to kind of fight or defend ourselves with. So there's this huge, kind of the metaphor, you said I could just be me. The metaphor we always, I always use is like, we're the mistress. You only come see us in the motel, so you won't take us out in public. You won't say what it is, right? But you're always coming to us. And so, but we learned it organically, and we learned the impact we were having in that way, right? And so, and then I think UC Law was the first people, and it was kind of a joke. I saw their CFO, Dave Stuart. He was kind of holding court outside one of these cocktail parties, and he's a big guy and kind of had 2 whiskeys in, talking shit. And I was like, "You're gonna fire and I was a few whiskeys in and talking shit. I was like, "You're gonna fire those UC police and you're gonna hire us." 2 years later, he did it, and because what was happening is that around UC Law, there was encampments and there was stuff and the dealing and the using and stuff, and it was so thick nobody could get them out. I mean, and so what happened is that their enrollment dropped way down. People are not going to send their kids to school there, and they can't even get inside the front door, and there was no moving that. The police didn't move it. Nobody could move it. Because people are there, it's COVID. They're getting loaded on fentanyl. They're not moving. They got their tent set up. Their dealers are there. Everybody's like, But we were able, right, through our connection, through our communication, to convince people this isn't the right place to set up this kind of party. And that's always what it is. Like, look, it's always a conversation. Come on, man, there's kids here. This is what's going on here. You can't just be here, And usually when you talk to people like that, instead of, we don't have authority. We don't have guns. We can't detain you. We can't put our hands on you. God forbid our people put our hands on somebody. The few times it's happened, we've been on the front page of the paper. See? So it can never happen because you're guaranteed we're going to be on the front page of the paper or something bad to happen. So it's all about the conversation. It's about the energy. It's about an appeal to people's decency or an appeal, pay attention to something else what else is going on in society. And sometimes just badgering them until they move. But then what happened, because we had transformed Civic Center, the city kept having ideas. How about you just move here? How about you just, and then pretty soon our phone started ringing off the hook where we were literally getting hundreds of calls a day. I didn't even realize how serious it was. I was like, we're getting 12 calls every day, no exaggeration. And Bayron was like, no, there are hundreds. This is coming from senior centers. It was coming from daycare centers, people who own apartment buildings. Like, everyone is like, what is it going to take to put you outside my building? So at a point, it didn't make sense. We had to kind of have a clearinghouse because we were brand new. Remember, at this point, we're like 3 years old. Now we're up to like 600, 700, 800 employees. You can imagine everybody we can't manage all these accounts. We were bleeding money anyway because we couldn't even keep up with billing and stuff. So the city kind of consolidated everything, put it under one roof. So somebody else was kind of clearing house, managing the business, which was also a bad idea, but that's another story for us. Anyway, so that's kind of how it evolved. But basically, to get to your question, because I'll go down a rabbit hole and forget your first question, but it was about the model. So it was about, we know connection counts. We know, this is what I mean, common sense. All the studies will show. If you want somebody to comply, the best way is to talk to them and be respectful. It's not to yell. It's not to try to, because then you bring that up in other people. And if people already suffering from schizophrenia and they're on some crazy drugs where they're out of their mind, you're gonna trigger their trauma, and you just got a mess. And not only that, let me say this. Yes, you can put the police everywhere and that'll help. The police do not want to be down there. There's no upside for the police in dealing with this population. It's a pain in the ass. There's always problems. You're arguing with people. They don't have that kind of time. Somebody does something. They do something. Now they got the same problems as us. They're on the front page of the paper. But a lot of the police don't have the same experiences, right? And so they have their own insecurities and fears in a way that people who have been on the level 4 yard for maybe 10, 20, 30 years do not, because they're much better at reading what's a real threat versus what's somebody saying boogie, boogie, boogie to scare you because they're feeling scared. There's all these dynamics that are different that the police, they don't have it. They're not even interested in having it. And, the police were really, we know what the police were originally started for, but at this, where we are in history now, it's to prevent and deter intervening crime. This is not any of that. This is people who are in distress all in one area trying to live and survive and play out their life. And the police really don't want any part of it. And so, they were very suspicious of us for a long time. I think they're just finally kind of getting over it. But what I hear from everyone now, they're really appreciative of us. They're like, oh, God, just please let Urban Alchemy do it. They got a big thing going on 6th Street now. That police are down there. They got all these, and they're all like, oh, my God, I wish Urban Alchemy would just come out here because nobody wants to deal with this. They really don't. So it's just a matter of them being able to anoint us and not feel embarrassed about it or not be afraid that there's going to be blowback, that they signed off on us and now we turn out to be the criminal boogeymen that everyone thought we were. So I think once they get comfortable with that, then we can really do a lot better as an organization. But right now, still, we're still struggling, but we're okay.
Forrest, let me just. Oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna.
Yeah.
I was gonna tag on a little jargon onto the model, if that's cool, just to echo some of this. And so one of the things that I've been able to do as part of this partnership was kind of have free reign with practitioners out on the streets from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. as they're doing their work. So I spent about a year and a half, 2 years, virtually every day hanging out with practitioners as they're doing their work so that I could try to finally put my finger on the model in academic terms. Like how the heck do we do this kind of non-violent, non-coercive public safety? And it took me watching and then reading through. It turns out I found some answers in kind of like old social exchange theory, business school folks. There were all these studies going on in like the 1950s to 1980s that were distinguishing between formal authority, right? The authority you have, like given your role, you're a supervisor, you're a cop, you're whatever, and like actual authority, like your ability to connect with people in ways that get people to behave in new ways, right? And this is based on something we can just think of as like social debt, right? You do a favor for someone. This could be a supervisor in a workplace, getting to know your name, getting to know your kids' names, saying, "Oh, you don't need to take PTO for that. Like just take the afternoon off," right? These are like little things. This could be, in poor neighborhoods, this is something like a free bus pass to someone or directions somewhere or the shelter's over this way or you can get in line in front of me. Like I see that you've got a wheelchair, right? Like little things like this establish social debt. And so what we see on the street nonstop is practitioners who were there for, 7 hours, 8 hours a day, creating social debt with every single person who comes around. And this could be as little as saying hello. You wouldn't believe how many people in the Tenderloin, I would be standing next to practitioners, they'd say, "No one said hello and good morning to me in 2 years. Thank you so much." And they would come back the next day and that hello would turn into, "Where are you headed to?" Right? And over like every single fleeting interaction, they're establishing social debt with people. And that social debt then allows practitioners to come and say, "Hey, can you help me out here and do X, Y, and Z?" So little mundane things, but also like there's pretty profound things going on that practitioners are doing. You have the numbers of how many overdoses that practitioners reverse. I'm talking, I don't know if folks have been in an overdose reversal, right? These are people laying on the sidewalk. Sometimes they've lost their pulse. They're not breathing. Practitioners come. They're equipped with Narcan. They resuscitate folks. They bring them back to life. The EMTs are not getting there in time to save people's life. In a 12-hour shift with a set of practitioners, we reverse 5 overdoses. This is how prevalent it is. But every overdose reversal, right, is also an incredibly profound social debt that you've gathered, right? You reverse someone's overdose, they're back out on the street sometimes the next day. Right? And suddenly you now have saved that person's life. And so if there's a squabble going on over here between two of that person's buddies, or if something's happening over here that this person has a connection to, you can walk over as a practitioner and you now have this bond, right? Because you have brought them back from the brink of death, right? That you can ask them to do these things. So, everything across that spectrum, from super mundane, hello, how are you doing, to saving people's lives, is just constantly building social debt. And that's actually like the crux of what gives people authority. And it's, for me, as somebody who has never really seen examples of how we do authority outside of a kind of formal, violent kind, this for me, I think, was one of the biggest takeaways of how we can think about doing community, how we can think about doing safety that's nonviolent.
I just want to acknowledge Louis. One of his things because Lou was our original trainer, and he was the one who set up the Civic Center. So he would buy a pack of cigarettes. I remember the first time, "Lou, you smoke?" "No," because he would, and dollar bills and buying people coffee and all these kinds of things that, as Lou would call it, our social bank account. You got to put a lot of deposits before you make the withdrawal. And the withdrawal is, you can't be getting high right here. You can't be fighting, that kind of stuff. "Can you do me a favor, Ann? You're agitated? Okay, I get it. Don't beat his ass right here. Let's go over here and let me give you a cup of coffee. You want a cigarette with that? Okay." So there's a different kind of bond. And then people seeing this is a person on the street, they're looking out for everybody. They're not going to let anything go down. They're not going to let somebody just jump on me and beat me. They're not going to let, whatever, a child, everyone that knows it, that person right there, they're looking out for me. And they know everybody around here. And they're not scared. And they got buddies and walkie-talkies. You know what I mean? So it just gives people a sense of safety. But they're not here to hurt me. They're not here to report me or report on me. They're not going to take me to jail. That's, it's just to make sure that everybody here, you can be you, you can do you. But we're all going to be safe.
I just want to make a note to our audience here that in a few minutes we're going to turn it over to you to join the conversation. Some of our friends from IAJS will be circulating note cards for you to write questions on, and I'll get the questions up here. And we're doing that so we can hear as many questions as possible. But we'll continue our conversation. Just know that that's coming. So just a quick observation. Actually, when I started grad school, this is not my field of study, but when I started grad school, this notion of community policing was a big deal. And the model that people were talking about of community policing has a lot of the qualities that you all have mentioned, the kind of notion that you get to know the community and not that you're a physical presence, but you also know about people, you know their families, you know their history, develop relationships. So it has some of those qualities, but it sounds like you get all the upside without any of the downside. But I want to just ask you about some of the challenges with this model. And, you can feel free to run with that in any way you want. And maybe, Forrest, I'll start with you in terms of what you've seen through your research, and then Lena, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, sure. First, I'll say on community, as somebody who is a vocal critic of community policing, I think it includes, and it's interesting. We can talk a little bit. I have a paper that we've evaluated the crime reduction capacities. We use this quasi-experimental design, and it's off under review right now. And one of the reviewers was like, "Oh, it sounds like community policing." And I was like, "Oh no, I'm really going to have to distinguish this." Right. So, a community policing model is that community members get together maybe once a month at the local church, and there are a couple officers there, and you work out the problems of the neighborhood. This could be anything small. In Chicago, I observed a lot of these. Anything small from like, there's feral cats in the abandoned building next door, and they're pooping on the grass, right? Like that could be something. Then the officer tries to like figure out a way with like the building department to try and solve these things, or like, oh, we've got, a business selling liquor to minors, and so we solve that problem. And one of my critiques is that rather than giving power to the community in the ways that we would imagine it does, it just entrenches the police even further into our everyday lives and minor problems, right? The cat now becomes a problem of the police officer, right? The crack in the sidewalk becomes a problem that the police take. And so suddenly the police have expanded their jurisdiction. And so I think there's a big distinction, and why I just want to kind of needle this is that this does seem to me to be community policing without further in fact, it does the opposite, right? It doesn't further insinuate the police in our lives. It actually shows us that there is a way that we can do those policing tasks without relying on the state and relying on state violence. One thing, directly to your question, one thing about this model is that it really does depend on a kind of minimum efficacy of the state, a minimum efficacy of the city, right? The notion that it looks very different to be able to walk up to somebody that you have social debt with, who's in the midst of, about to smoke off a piece of foil. And if there's a safe consumption site within reach, right, saying, hey, I'll walk you down the safe consumption site. There's no cops. You can smoke freely there. There's services there. Like, let's walk down and let's do that. Is very different. And I think rightly should be perceived differently than, hey, you can't just do that here, right? There's this kind of thin line, right, between a kind of banishment, exclusion, and directing folks to services. And we can't direct folks to services unless municipal governments and county governments are actually delivering the resources that practitioners need on the ground to send and to refer people to actually get the services that they need. And I think I hear a lot of the critiques. I now shoulder them quite a bit of the critiques laid at the feet of urban alchemy, and there are a couple organizations that are very upset about urban alchemy that I think don't recognize the kind of blurry line between the work that it takes, the work that they're doing in a city that's actually caring for its citizens, and a city that is not caring for its citizens, right? That we need more safe consumption sites, we need more affordable housing, we need more resources, we need more shelter, and that kicks urban alchemy into kind of hyperdrive. But absent those, we're just kind of maybe shuffling problems around, like the city has to step up to actually give practitioners resources to dole out to folks.
I would agree. I think we do some things really well. I would say San Francisco, who's kind of, some people as we've expanded accuse us of like, they're going to come here and bring homelessness with them. Look at California. Look at San Francisco. Why would you bring them? But it's really like, we're so good because we started at the worst places, right? We're the canary in the coal mine. We've seen how bad it can get, right? Because we're not only in the Tenderloin, Skid Row, all these Portland, Oregon, all these places where it's going down. And I think most people don't understand how the dynamics in the streets really work. They're very removed from it. And so they don't get it. They don't get what's happening with fentanyl. They don't get the changes that are happening, with the unhoused in the streets, or how mental health and how all that. Most people don't understand the dynamics. We've been locked into a narrative that's 40 or 50 years old, and therefore a social service structure that's 40 or 50 years old. And so you have urban alchemy come and the people who've been at the top of the food chain, who've been, the king and the queens of the poor and the homeless, and you got to come through me to get, and here it comes, and it's messed up, and it's going to be messed up unless you come through me and I tell you how it's going to be. And so urban alchemy came on the scene, as I've been told, and did not ask permission, and changed dynamics that have seemed intractable for 40 or 50 years that fast. So what we did is we pulled the covers from over them because we exposed how easy it is to transform things in the worst parts, right? And we didn't do it through, and so what they wanted to do was say, they're bullying everyone. Look at those black and brown guys, the poor white homeless people, and they're scaring them, and the poor white women, and they're raping them in the streets. And, so these are all the kind of narratives that you'll read between the lines in the papers and all that, but no police reports about it, no other formal reports, but just this kind of perception about who we are and why we need to be feared, which is very interesting because it also comes from the people that we thought would be our biggest supporters. And so that's been the hardest part. It's being just trashed in a very organized, calculated way in the press. And the perceptions and having to defend ourselves against things, and people filing lawsuits with, and the press picking up what they file. There's no penalty for perjury, and then blasting it everywhere, and just all those, and having and being responsible, being made responsible from the highest levels of authority in cities and municipalities, right? From mayor's offices, police departments, homeless departments, to do the hardest things, doing them, and then just being so maligned. And it's hurtful. And recently I had to talk to somebody that was extremely high up in the San Francisco Police Department, and said, and had the conversation, and said, you guys didn't speak up for us. You never said what we did, because I'm like, we need to think about withdrawing from San Francisco, because our funding was over some Anyway, and he was like, you can't. This whole city will crumble. It'll go back 40 or 50 years. Why didn't you say something? Why didn't you say something? You guys never say anything, and you allow us to take hit after hit after hit. That's when I got the mistress analogy. But I'm also like, during the George Floyd, people talked about the police so bad. I said, San Francisco police force is down 40%, people not coming in to work. Those who do aren't really doing what they need to be doing. You know it. And so even though they gave you, because people would say to us, well, you're getting $26 million. You should just be happy. Just deal with it. Man, we didn't ask you for your $26 million. You asked us. And when the police department got more money, after all the stuff, everybody came back and, and then it increased the police department's budgets everywhere. Did it bring your people back? No. Your morale is still down. Police still don't want to come to work. What makes you think is any different for us? We are human beings. When our practitioners are out there for a lot of times putting their lives on the line, dealing with all kind of humiliation and different stuff, there's a lot of beautiful things too. But and to represent us in that way and have nobody, you rely on us so much, but no one ever speaks up for us, it just makes us say, what's the point? And I think it seems petty, right? When there's all these miraculous things going on and this great movement for change and all these kinds of things, but it's also really hard, right? When labels are slapped on you and the worst kind of things, like for a lot of our guys, the worst thing you could ever, and this goes into prison culture and politics, the worst thing you can ever be accused of is sexual assault. Right? And to have that be something that constantly comes up in rumors, again, not one time, a police report, right? But if you look at what kind of the in between the lines and a lot of the reports in the media, that's always kind of what's implied, and that we're dangerous and all these kinds of things, and it just makes it really, really hard. And then to come into new cities and the first thing they want to, well, what about this? What about that? And it's like, man, you spent a year trying to get us here. And we come and all you want to do is throw this stuff that has absolutely nothing behind it. And you just like, we know you guys are bad guys. Prove to us you're not. And just having to always answer to that kind of stuff. It's like, we'll take what's real. We'll own it. But a lot of stuff that's not, that gets thrown at us because of people's prejudice and perceptions and bigotry, I think that is really the hardest part.
So, Lena, what I hear you saying at some level is that people don't want to change and they want to fall back on the old ways of doing things and old ways of thinking about people and safety that are detrimental to the very efforts that people like you and Forrest care about. And so some version of that, somebody might say, so does this thing work? Does this thing work? Does the observation that you made, Forrest, walking down the hill in the Tenderloin and seeing this dramatic difference, I think you described it as almost like a curtain or a wall. Does it work? And I want to make sure that we have a chance, because you have some findings that suggest something about the efficacy of the ambassadors program the practitioners program. And I want to give you a chance to just kind of share what you're able and willing to share about what you found.
I mean, I think the top line is has Kylan arrived yet? Still not? Yay, there he is. Kylan and I have been working very hard on a quasi-experimental design. I kind of alluded to this. Essentially, what we've done, because we know we need some kind of causal claim about whether or not it was in fact urban alchemy practitioners on the street who have done this work and who have done any reductions in crime. So we've essentially, without getting in the weeds, paired every urban alchemy block, every urban alchemy section with another block in San Francisco that has similar kind of crime numbers up to the year leading to when urban alchemy launched. And we've done this kind of interrupted time series and found total crime in urban alchemy areas, we can attribute a 15% drop directly to urban alchemy. We can attribute in total crime. We can attribute a 30% drop in drug crimes to urban alchemy and a 15% drop in crimes related to behavioral health. So these are, the small kind of ticky-tacky things, trespassing, loitering, those kinds of things. And this is kind of throwing the kitchen sink in terms of controls, right? This is not a COVID effect, and this is not a displacement effect. This is not merely displacing incidents to other areas. I think that this has been a big maybe critique and worry about urban alchemy, right? Are you merely just pushing problems elsewhere? And so we're able to integrate this into the model. And we show that it is not, in fact, just displacement. So net of displacement or COVID, these are the kinds of things we've seen. I don't know if this is the chance for it. I know we're talking here about collaborations and what it's been like. Wow, I think I've been doing this for a while, and I still think maybe I'm incredibly naive about the way scientific publishing works. But I mean, I think there is this notion that like you find good findings, important kind of staggering findings about a new phenomenon, and you submit them to a journal, and off you go, off to the races, even journals that publish things very quickly. That is not the case. We currently have an R&R at a really fantastic place. But, one of the things that we've been running into, which I think is just really stressed to me, how the kind of norms of academia and the norms of doing this kind of work in the community have increasingly kind of pulled away from each other. And Lena, you alluded to it before, like the way that this program operated, right? The urban alchemy is on one block, and then somebody says, the city or UC Law says, wait, come to our block, and then they go. And then, oh, there's emergency on this block. The next week they go there. Oh, there's an emergency on this block. They go there, and they kind of roll this out according to where the emergency is happening. This is a big violation of like a research design, right? Like this is the worst research design that you could possibly have, right? The way that we've RCT-ified, the way that we've, randomized controlled trial-ified social science findings is that no, here's what you do. You get a big foundation grant, and then you go to an organization and you say, hey, let's do an RCT. Okay, next year we are going to roll out, this intervention on these experimental blocks. And now we're going to have these control blocks over here that we're not treating, but we're also going to observe these. 2 or 3 years later, maybe you have the start of your program. Meanwhile, all the difficulties and emergencies that urban alchemy has been dealing with, right, are still would still have been on the street. So there's been this tension of like the ways in which we validate findings, how we validate something is actually going on in the real world, really makes us out of sync. It's as though the more fixated on randomized controlled trials we get, the harder it is to not just evaluate a program like urban alchemy, but the lack of evaluation of urban alchemy means there's nothing written about this model. Right? So there's no science on the model. It's as though there's no citation for me to grab to say, look, there's a model that works of non-police community-based public safety because no one's written that study on it. But you can't write that study on it unless you have the RCT proving it happened. So we're in this kind of loop that makes it really, really hard to convince the world that something is in fact happening that's real and important here.
Yeah, I want to turn it over to our friends in a second, but I just want to, Lena, ask you to weigh in really quick. So I want to ask you what this collaboration looks like in practice. We've been talking about a shared interest in these issues. Forrest is studying urban alchemy. You run urban alchemy. But the relationship is more than that. And I wonder if you can take us inside briefly what the relationship between Forrest Stuart, Stanford University researcher, Lena Miller, CEO of Urban Alchemy. What does that look like in practice? And what are some of the challenges too?
Well, like I said, I got my doctorate in 2020. And one of the things I learned from, going to school in a doctoral program is that nothing is true unless a peer-reviewed studies had validated it. Whether the earth is round, what temperature water freezes, do babies like attractive people versus ugly people, whatever. If you eat kale, does it work? This thin group of doctorates have to stamp it, right, based on research. And so we knew what was happening. Right. And I think everyone knows what's happening, which is why we keep growing despite the critics. Right. And no matter what we face, it's like that doesn't faze the government. You know why it doesn't faze the government? Not because I got buddies who are busy giving me no bid contracts, but because they know what's actually happening. They're getting reports from the homeless department, the police. They got cameras on 15 cameras on every square foot in the Tenderloin. Everybody knows exactly, and they're watching their numbers, right? But like I said, we're their favorite mistress. Oh, they love us. It's the only place they feel love and warmth and understanding and get what they need, but they will not bring us out in public. And so we know what that makes us. And also what's a phenomena that's been happening is that, and this is every city we're in, people are trying to reverse engineer our programs. Other programs, including the city, because they want our outcomes. They don't want urban alchemy. So I knew the only way that we're going to make sure that we're sustained is to make sure we got somebody's stamp. Academia has to stamp us. And so Stanford is, hey, that's the, right? And so when Forrest came sniffing around, I saw something going on. I want to see if I can study you. I'm like, yeah, do you? Okay. I need this because I know we're reducing crime. I know it because there are people, all these city people are whispering. I know it because everyone's calling us. I know it because they keep expanding us. They won't give us any stats, though. So I can't sell it. I can't talk about it. Everybody has the information but us. That's as you study whatever you want, but just get me that, and it's good. And it just so happened. So later I got to know if I really liked them, but I was, I was a little, what's the word, weary, because I'm, weird. You got to be weary of academics. They're always up to something, right? You never know. And then, but I liked them. He got me talking, boy, I probably talked for 3 hours. I was like, what the hell are you doing, Lena? Anyway. And then he gave me his books, and I saw that we had such a similar background with the young people, right? And it was like the same group of kids, just his were in Chicago, mine were in Hunters Point, but the same stuff, mine was in a music group. We won't say who's his are, it's top secret. And then I read his book about policing in Skid Row, and I seen a lot of these subtle dynamics, and he was calling them out and named the same things, because you would think the good guys were somebody else and the bad guys were somebody. Forrest caught it. So I said, okay, I trust him. And so I was like, listen, we want you to come in. We want you to see everything, because there's so much mystique around us, right? The guys from prison, people would always come up to me. I was talking to such and such at the pit stop. I didn't know he'd been in prison for 30 years. Oh my God. It's just like, okay, he's so easy to talk to. Yes. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, right. Yes, he did. People are always so surprised. But so there's all this mystique and all these perceptions and all this stuff that people, project on to our folks. And so I'm like, come in so you can see and you can tell the real story, in the language people need to hear it in. Because when I'm saying it's not falling the road, when people can't hear it the right way. God forbid the newspapers to tell you who we are. So that was the relationship. We needed that validity. It was never going to come by way of us. If for no other, not just because of the cognitive dissonance, but, and it took me a while to realize this, we're now a $100 million organization. Okay? Everyone is looking at us. Why are they making that kind of money and not me? I've been running my nonprofit for 20, 40 years. I'm still at 20 million, 5 million, 8 million. I need a piece of that. And so we are, the threats are coming at us from every direction. And the only, for us, what we know, part of our protection is going to be that validation from somebody who's done it the right way. Not someone who's just talking shit in the newspaper or somewhere else, but those randomized control study, a real academic, a MacArthur genius from Stanford University. Please, somebody speak up and tell them what's happening. Because as much as we say it, no one can hear it.
I was just going to say, I like that origin story, and thank you. I like this relationship. I'm so glad that you decided to trust me. My version of the story is a little more like stumping for public sociology. One of the things that we try to do to honor kind of the legacy of the late Michael Buravoy is to try to make community partners and the publics we care about co-creators in knowledge. And one of the questions that means asking is going to people and saying, what can I lend and what do you want to know, right? That it's like, you tell me some research questions that you're interested in. Like, what are the things you need to know to solve the dilemmas in your world? What are the things you need to know to make your program better, to take a look at yourself? So really trying to think about the research questions that come from the communities we care about rather than the ones I devise right in my office up here on the second floor, kind of gazing out at like the Rodin sculpture, right? My version of the story from my side of the table where I was sitting, I asked Lena that question, what do you need to know? And you laid out two things, right? Which are the exact same things that like we know this is going on, but we don't have like the peer-reviewed data to show it. One, we know we're reducing crime. Show it how, show where we need to improve to do that stuff. And then also, which I think we're doing well, that was kind of like, I think the first step of this collaboration. And the second was, we know that we are drastically improving the lives and outcomes of people coming out of prison, for formerly incarcerated folks. We know it. We see it when guys are, getting off parole long before they thought they were supposed to. We know it by seeing folks, rekindle relationships with family members that they maybe never thought they would have, to see family members proud of them, to be with accountable peer groups out on the street, pulling them back from all kinds of things that might tip the balance into heading down the wrong way. Like, we see it, but like, how does one quantify it? How does one get at this stuff? And so this next part of this collaboration, using state data, we're going to be looking to see how the recidivism rates for urban alchemy practitioners compare to kind of California in general, and then pairing that, like we did with this first plan, with a qualitative component of sitting down with practitioners to kind of get at the mechanisms that might be driving that lowered recidivism rate, why guys are able to get off parole earlier. And I've seen tons of it. I have tons of qualitative data, but as Lena's saying, like, my interview transcripts, my ethnographic observations only go so far in convincing the kind of social scientific community. So we also have to have some hard numbers backing that up. Some good regression tables with lots of little stars next to them.
Yeah, so one of the things that you're doing, Forrest, is telling us not only whether something works, but how it works. And that's incredibly powerful. And I'll just editorialize a little bit on the Love Fest that's going on right here, which is, we had a conversation a couple of weeks ago, and doing research of the sort that you all are doing together is incredibly difficult. There are different needs, different demands, different timelines, as you've both sort of alluded to, but there's also a deep sense of trust that has to exist between the partners. And Lena, you wrapped up the conversation saying that Forrest is the real deal. And you're not the first person I've heard say that. And I know from many conversations I've had with Forrest that I don't think you've ever said the real deal, but I think it encapsulates the kind of trust and admiration that the Forrest has for you. So that's incredibly important for doing this kind of research, in addition to all the kind of other logistical things. But I want to just pull in some of the questions now. And I think, Forrest, actually your last observation about the role that the actual work of the practitioners plays in their lives as a kind of an opportunity to be engaged in a community, an opportunity for employment, an opportunity to feel a sense of pride, a sense of purpose, all the kinds of things that all of us want out of life, right? And somebody asked about emotional intelligence. And this is for either of you, they pick it up, but they wanted to know whether there are other ways to develop emotional intelligence. Lena, you mentioned that some of the emotional intelligence actually comes from the experience of having been incarcerated. And she wants to know if, this questioner, this person who asked this question wants to know if this is an achievable skill set for most of us.
Yes, but there's levels to this. I'm sorry to tell everybody, but and the research backs this up. Emotional intelligence is, developed through suffering. Survival, right? When your survival depends on your ability to read people, communicate with people, and engage with them in a way that they won't hurt you and or kill you, you get real good at it. So, there's a lot of urban alchemy practitioners here right now. Can you stand up so people know who you are? Even though we're all dressed alike. So I want you to know, like, all these people, right? They manage. They're not. These are all high level people, right? They all manage multi-million-dollar programs and hundreds of staff. So these guys are at the top of their game. But and they can also speak to it. But and this is what I've learned from them. So I'm just good at bringing it together and giving it to you real quick. But on a level 4 yard, there's a lot of riots. There's all kinds of stuff. So it goes beyond. I thought, when I was in school, get my doctorate in psychology, I'm gonna be an expert in trauma. Then I really got into micro expressions, you know what I mean? And I'm gonna be an expert in micro expressions and all this stuff, but there's even a level that goes beyond micro expressions, which a lot of them have talked about being on a level 4 yard, which is having to read energy, right? And so that's a whole different level. And so if your survival depends on it, you're going to learn how to read energy. So it doesn't mean you can't pick it up. Yes, being a good, they teach this. What's the guy's name? What's the psychologist who started the whole micro expression? He studied Ekman. Ekman is his name. Remember they did the show that lied to me based on it?
Any psychologists in the room? Any psychologists?
Sorry, wrong crowd. Anyway, so he went all around the world and he studied people's facial expressions and showed, you can read people's face. It's a common language in humanity. But you get better and better at tuning it and getting it down until you can just start to feel people's energy, right? And that takes a lot. Right? It takes a lot. So everyone is capable of doing it. But, like any hard thing, who's going to want to sit down, and study somebody's everything and get real good at it? Now, if your survival is dependent on it, guess what? Oh, you're going to do it. And especially every single day, if your survival is dependent, you're going to get very good at it. So I think, yes, you can. But as we were talking about on the way up here, you can't. The experience in prison is not something that you can get anywhere else. Even if you decide you're going to be what's those guys that they always got those commercials for that go and they paint their faces and they go and, the Navy SEALs or something. Even if you do that, right, some hard thing like that to build toughness and all these kind of things, it's not the same as being in prison. It's not the same of losing loved ones and not being able to be there, and your mother is dying, and all these all these things, being locked in solitary confinement, all these things that you go through, cavity searches, that you have to. There's another level you have to get to. So yeah, not having gone through that level of, and I'm not saying everybody comes out with emotional intelligence. Some people come out angry. Some people lose their minds. But if you come out the other end of it, there's a superpower that I don't even think we've begun to tap into, that these gentlemen have, and some of our women, but there's less women who've done life in prison than there are men. So I'm not trying to, but that's just the reality. But yeah, that's where that superpower comes from.
I think, this. When I heard you say that in our first meeting, it was the first time that I had heard anyone running a big organization with formerly incarcerated folks speak about gifts and talents and assets. And it was, like I've done a lot of stuff around reentry and studying reentry programs, and in Chicago doing community violence intervention kind of stuff. And I've never heard this kind of perspective, right? That like we have a population of people who can do some task much better than anybody else on earth. And so I was like, okay, I'm hooked. Like you've got me intrigued. And so I think this was part of like the kind of trust conversation. And I don't know where emotional intelligence comes from, but I have reams and reams of data on what it looks like out on the streets. And I just wanted to share one of the things. I don't know if it's appropriate to say like I was, kind of amused or tickled by it, but with practitioners, I would play this game where we'd be standing on the corner and I'd like point 2 blocks away and I'd be like, this dude right here, what's this guy gonna do? And practitioners had this ability to say, okay, this guy, I think this guy's gonna come down, and this guy standing right here, I think he might have a problem with this guy. Like this guy might, I don't know, there's something about this guy that I think he's not gonna like this guy. And they'd be like, okay, let's see what happens. And lo and behold, like they called it 2 blocks away. Or they, Forrest, watch this. You see this guy over here? Keep an eye on him. Keep an eye on him. There's something up with this guy. I'd be like, what are you talking about? And lo and behold, this guy would walk another block and then throw something at a car. So it was like, it was wild. And once they knew that I was kind of tickled by this, that it just came out. And so I would have these moments where I'd say, anytime like you're seeing the scene and you think something's going to happen, like let me know. And they had this predictive power to kind of tell what people were about to do and do in public. I think, I don't know, as a sociologist, talk of reading energy, like, it's new to me. And so I think it took me kind of seeing it out in the streets to say, okay, there is something here that's intangible that I can't put my finger on. And I believe you that you say that this is what's happening. It's really neat.
You want one of the guys to answer? Who?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. We have a lot of expertise in the room.
Answering the question of
The
Like
emotional reading energy, emotional intelligence, how you develop it.
hard crowd here, just based on my inexperience. I would say, I usually have a story of a guy who has a conversation. It's level 4, high desert, probably one of the most insane and scary prisons. I think everybody here who's been to high desert, no matter how big and tough they thought they were, in truth, they were afraid. Level 4 is the highest security level of any prison other than a supermax, which would be solitary confinement. But there's the story of a guy looking out his window, and guy from another race walks by and says, okay now. And it's just a common courtesy that happens to be respectful and to be courteous. And this happens for maybe a year. Same Groundhog Day, every day. Okay now. And then one day, the guy walks by and says, okay now. And then this guy turns to his cellmate and says, put on your boots. We're going to war today. And he says, what do you mean we're going to war? He said he's been doing that for 2 years. No, there's something different about today. Something that I can read, that I can feel. And if I don't change it and I don't get ready, I will lose my life. And many men and women have lost their life by not listening to that saying. And we tell a story, it's a joke about men on level 2 prisons who have seen a level 4, and then maybe they're 20 years into their sentence, and it's a hot day and you don't want to get burned. Everyone has to get on the ground if it's a pretty big incident. And this older gentleman starts to move towards the grass and lay his blanket out on one of the softest areas. And they're like, what are you doing? He said, the yard's going to go down. And like clockwork, it does, because he felt it. My friend Brian, put your hand up. When he walked into this beautiful establishment from the outside, he said, this is one of the most peacefulest and most safest spaces that I can feel right now. Because that's the level that he has, the understanding, which it is. You guys all make it that way. But it is something that you do have to read, and you do have to, I say gut, some say instinct, others say Holy Spirit. Another person might call it emotional intelligence. But you do get it, and you do get it fast, because most of your life you are in fear, because your life is in danger, and you should feel fear. If you don't, you're probably crazy. That's the best way I can explain it.
Thank you, Lou. Thank you for that, Lou. So we have time for, we go to 1:30, is that right, Troy? Yeah. I know, time flies when it's fascinating and you're having fun. This is a question that I think speak to some ambition here. It says, what needs to change so that there is no need for the amazing work you are doing in SF anymore, policy wise? Like what would have to change so to make urban alchemy obsolete?
You mean us standing on the corners kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, it's a massive question. I know you all do a lot of work, so why don't we stick to the community-based public safety aspect of it, the practitioners program.
Yeah, I think regular men and women who are willing and able to stand up and do the same thing we do, who are willing to be responsible for the community, to tell the guy, and I'm sorry, but I'm just saying what we see, right? Who's jacking off in front of the playground, that they're not going to do that here. For the person who's standing on the sidewalk, right, or smoking foil right on Market Street, where elderly people and are trying to get by, or all those things. Like for somebody to say no, for someone who's just jumped on the pregnant woman and is beating her up, and everyone is screaming, "Make it stop! Somebody make it stop!" All these things are real things. I'm sure you could tell by the way I'm described that have happened that will intervene. Right? I mean, that's what it's going to take, because that's what you're talking about. You're talking about people that are going to stand up and say, that I understand whatever it is you're going through. You can be angry, you can be on, some bad drugs, you can be, having a psychotic break, and okay. But you're not going to put your hands on somebody else or do something that is going to make somebody else unsafe or traumatize them. There's standards that we have that we all kind of buy into, right, in society. There's some things, as Bayron always likes to say, that make us unsafe, other things that make us feel uncomfortable, right? You can sit there and you can talk to yourself all day long. That's fine. You may even be screaming. But when you do some other kinds of things that crosses that line, right? And we all know what those, kind of public nudity for the sake of, shock and that kind of thing, using drugs in the public, blocking the sidewalk, being aggressive towards someone physically and stuff that, is not engaged with you like that, like all those things, right? And I'm a pretty tough woman. I've been lifting weights my whole life. I was like San Francisco's first woman on the wrestling team and all that. But, I'm a woman. I walked out, I don't always feel safe. I'm very clear that somebody can jump on me and, and I think it doesn't matter to where you get in life. That's just a reality. And people will do it. If they think they can hurt you and get away with it, they will. My daughter used to tell me, well, I don't understand why people rob old ladies. That's not fair. I said, no one is trying to rob somebody to get a fair fight. They're trying to rob somebody to get away with it. And that's what a lot of this is. And so I think what it's going to take to make urban alchemy, unneeded is, one, to change the culture. But also we have to face the fact, right, that everybody is not out here in their right minds. There is a very different kinds of drugs on the street now. People hear me loud and clear. I have been trying to put this out in editorials. I've been saying this to anyone who would listen. The drugs now are different. People are not in their right minds. Their brain architecture has been transformed permanently. These drugs make you psychotic. Okay, and we're just not, and that's on top of all the trauma and everything else that we're leaving untreated. Then you put all those people together and get them to bounce around on top and re-traumatize each other. Okay, this is something we haven't even begun to deal with, much less talk about openly. So you talk about like that'll maybe 40 years unless society just all of a sudden, all puts our heads together and act like we acted to get a vaccine for COVID. I mean, no one's even paying attention. We talked about this on the phone, that I don't want to take us down another rabbit hole, but the stuff we're talking about is like this stuff should have been started maybe 10, 20 years ago. This guy is the only guy who's even studying this stuff that I know of on the street in real time, right? And this is on his spare time. This is not even, from my understanding, I don't want to get anyone in trouble, but it's not like a university funded, let's go get in the streets, let's see what's happening in real time, let's figure these things out. Like, we are so far behind. And this thing is blowing up. And that's why everyone is like, I don't understand. We keep putting money into homelessness and it just keeps getting worse. Because you're not addressing what's actually happening. Nobody is. So these perceptions, the narrative that we have about homelessness and the stuff that's going on the street is 40 years old. So
That's a perfect answer. Can I just
Go ahead.
30 seconds?
30 seconds. Go for it,
Mine
Forrest.
is mine is super boring. It's the same one that everybody in this room, I'm sure, hears, that like Urban Alchemy is responding to, right? People falling through the social safety net. So any way we can reweave some of the social safety net, I think we begin to make Urban Alchemy more and more obsolete. But back to like the original problem, like I don't actually think that gives us a theory of change, right? I think this is the conversation we have in this kind of room all the time, of like, we can all agree that like major structural transformations need to happen. But when we ask ourselves like, okay, like what do we do tomorrow to like march toward that? I think that that's where we start to stutter a little bit more, right? But I think this is one of the things about working with Urban Alchemy. And I think Lena having enough trust in me to kind of put me out and let me kind of explore wherever I want to and talk to whoever I want to, that I think has moved me closer to a real answer of how we make Urban Alchemy obsolete. And it's my observation that the people responsible for making Urban Alchemy a multi-million-dollar program weren't a bunch of lefty activists, weren't a bunch of lefty academics. It was the businesses. It was the Merchants Association. It was the Business Improvement District. People that I, for my entire career, have been writing about as joint with the police, right? That like they're writing about them as though there is some kind of ideological push for them to want more and more police. I think what working with Urban Alchemy has shown me and disabused me of some things that I've written about very frequently in my work, is that if you put a non-police response to their problems in front of them and it works better than the police, they'll support that instead of the police. So when I talk to businesses in the Tenderloin, they're like, F the police. Like, I'm like, wait, what are you talking about? Like, this is not what, the business association is supposed to be saying. They're like, they call, they come, they don't do anything. We'd rather call a practitioner. The practitioner is going to deal with problems way better than we will. I actually think that like this for me is the Trojan horse, right? That like if we put better solutions in front of folks that have not been tried so far, that's how we get the folks who are most reticent about those kinds of larger structural changes to actually start believing in them. And yes, we have to satisfy some of their interests. But I think the problem has been we haven't had a proof of concept to put in front of people to even give them the imagination to think outside of the kind of conventional way that we deal with people who fall through the cracks of the safety net. Because if we can't get the Business Improvement District on board with rebuilding the kind of local welfare state, then guess what? The local welfare state is not going to be rewoven. The social safety net is not going to be rewoven. So I think for me, this is where I see Urban Alchemy as part of a theory of change. And I think that that's more Urban Alchemy, I would say, is what makes Urban Alchemy a little bit more obsolete.
So on that note, we are going to wrap up. And before we do, I just want to say a quick thank you to our colleagues at CCSRE, Paula and Alfredo and Bridget, and also the incredible staff that we have at IAJS, Jory, Sheila, Aisha, Chow, and Pat. Thank you so much for all of the work that you did to bring this together. I want to thank our friends from Urban Alchemy who came out and shared some of your experience both informally and then with the group. Please join me in thanking our friends from Urban Alchemy. One other staff member, Aisha Taha from IAJS. And then finally, thank you so much, Lena and Forrest, for the incredible work that you do, for giving us the opportunity to learn from you, and for giving us a model for how we can learn together about some of the most pressing issues of our time in ways that may allow us to do something about it. And we look forward to what you all continue to learn from this collaboration and the work that you do. Thank you. Thanks again for coming.